infectious diseases, research, medicine, health. Welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And now, broadcasting from the Outbreak News Skylar Studios in beautiful West Central Florida, here is your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, hey everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. Now, Texas officials reported a large anthrax outbreak this year, and the latest numbers were about 20 premises in 5 Texas counties that have had animals confirmed with anthrax. Now, my guest today was recently in Texas and over the summer to take a closer look at this outbreak. So joining me now is University of Florida Associate Professor of Medical Geography and returning guest, Dr. Jason Blackburn. Dr. Blackburn, welcome back to the show, sir.
Thank you very much. Nice to be back.
Sure. The outbreak is getting close to being over, but I would like to go ahead and take a look back at what you saw during the course of the summer, during the course of this outbreak. But first, I want to start with, this is Texas. So how are you and the University of Florida involved in a Texas anthrax outbreak?
Sure. So my lab is based at the University of Florida, and I'm based at the Emerging Pathogens Institute, and we broadly have an interest in emerging and re-emerging diseases all over the world. And in fact, my laboratory, the Spatial Epidemiology and Ecology Research Laboratory, which is housed within Geography and the Emerging Pathogens Institute, we focus a lot of our research efforts on anthrax worldwide, including Texas. In my own case, my own PhD was based on studying the ecology of anthrax in Texas. Texas has a long history within the United States of having anthrax outbreaks with relatively high frequency, at least for the United States. So the area of West Texas is an area that we've termed the enzootic zone. The area where the outbreak's been going on does see anthrax fairly regularly. And so the state's been working for a long time with ranchers and wildlife managers to try and manage and control the disease. So it has a long history in the area. Historically, West Texas was part of the sheep and cashmere industry, and historically in the United States as well as other parts of the world, anthrax was moved. The bacterium, Bacillus anthracis, was moved around in bone meal. It survives in animal bone in spore form for long periods. And so a lot of the genetics of the anthrax bacterium that we see in West Texas are strains that were probably moved as part of that industry. And then, of course, historically, we had a lot of cattle movement across the United States, and a lot of those cattle moved from southern and West Texas up through into the Dakotas going northward. And so we see a lot of genetics associated with that historical cattle movement and those historical livestock and agricultural practices. And then over the last 50 years, especially, we've seen a big growth in West Texas in the wildlife industry. So wildlife opportunities for hunting, wildlife opportunities for conservation programs. So you see these large properties with large numbers of wildlife. And so we're seeing anthrax occurring in each of those livestock and wildlife populations.
So what was kind of unique about this year's outbreak was the geographical spread that was much larger than the typical anthrax season in Texas. Dr. Blackburn, what can you tell us about the geography affected this year as opposed to the usual years?
So I think that's a good question. I think what I would say from the ranches that our lab visited and the ranches that have been reported through Texas Animal Health Commission, I don't know necessarily that the geography is wider. I think what's different about this year from previous years is the intensity of those outbreaks across that geography. So if we look back over the last 20 years, 2001 was a very large anthrax year in West Texas, well documented and well investigated. 2005 was another very intense outbreak year. Thousands of animals across a very large number of properties, and that was wildlife and livestock in each of those cases. 2010 was another year with a large number of cases, and then this year was very, very large. I think the difference in this year compared to some of those other years is the intensity, and by intensity I mean a large number of mortality events, anthrax mortalities on individual properties over a wide area. So in some previous years, 2010 for example, we were involved in studying a number of ranches with anthrax, and those ranches were all relatively close together. So you had a concentration of cases. What we saw this year is that from sort of the northern point of what they call the Anthrax Triangle up near Ozona, south past Del Rio and east towards Brackettville or Uvalde, we saw a very large number of properties reporting cases all around the same time. So I think the area of the outbreak was in that area that, as I said earlier, we call the enzootic zone, an area where we expect anthrax. But I think this year the intensity of anthrax across the region was much more widespread.
And do we know why? Was it one factor or multiple factors that made this year more intense?
So it's a really good question, and I think it's a question that we'll continue to try and answer by we, the sort of larger community that's interested in anthrax in Texas. But what we saw this year that is similar to those previous years is that anthrax in Texas is that intensity we think is driven by this wet spring, hot, dry summer condition. So if you get a very wet spring followed by a hot, dry period and then an intense amount of rain, we tend to see very large outbreaks in Texas following that second or third rain event. So that wet spring followed by a hot, dry period, it's actually at the end of that hot, dry period when there's a rain event. Following that rain event is when we start to see those cases really explode. During the 2005 outbreak, I was doing a lot of intensive sampling at that time, and what we found is that those conditions are ideal conditions for biting fly populations to explode. And the biting flies, we think, can be a mechanical transmitter of the bacterium. Mm-hmm. So as those animals are in their last stages of dying of anthrax, what that does to an animal is it's very difficult for that animal to walk very far. They're usually febrile and confused from the fever, and they're starting to go through a lot of neurological changes, and so they're losing a lot of motor function. And so that's an opportunity for those biting flies to really take advantage of that animal and feed on it. They're picking up the bacterium in the blood because the bacterium can be free in the blood, and then those flies can then jump to another animal. So that's something longtime anthrax researcher Martin Hugh Jones coined the space multiplier effect, that those flies can pick up the bacterium and move from one animal to the other. What we do know is that those rain events that are associated with those anthrax outbreaks are also associated with those biting fly explosions, those population explosions. What we do know about this year is that ranchers and responders were talking a lot about just how explosive those biting flies had been around the period that the outbreak began and through the early course of the outbreak. So the outbreak started being reported towards late June with a really big spike in cases and properties reporting around the 4th of July. And all of the ranchers that my team spoke with all noted that the biting fly population was explosive. The second thing that can happen when you get a lot of those animals dying all at once, because some of these properties were losing dozens or hundreds of animals at the same time, and when that happens, you get a lot of those carcasses on the ground. The blowflies come in and start feeding on those carcasses. So those necrophagous flies are feeding on carcasses, and they can spread that bacteria immediately around the carcass on vegetation and other substrate. And so we think that might play a role in amplifying cases by contaminating feed that other animals may come along and browse on. So those two fly dynamics we think play a big role in these really intense outbreaks that we see.
Yeah, just a side note on the biting flies. Do these flies strictly only bite animals, or do they also bite humans?
They can also bite humans. There are a handful of cases reported in the scientific literature of insect bites leading to cutaneous anthrax. So it's certainly a risk. And we certainly advise caution to the ranchers that are trying to control their outbreaks by cleaning up those carcasses to avoid those flies. Make sure they're wearing insecticide. Make sure they're wearing long sleeve. And then also when those in those immediate moments after those animals are dead, those biting flies can feed on those animals so long as there's still fresh blood that they can pull out with their proboscis. So in this particular year, we had one animal that my team was on site immediately after death, or actually as it died, and approximately 30 minutes after that animal died, I collected biting flies that were feeding on that animal post-death. I observed the feeding, and we did recover Bacillus anthracis out of those flies. So certainly that transmission mechanism is highly plausible.
Did you notice any specific animals were more affected than others in this particular outbreak?
So that's a really good question. I think it would be hard to answer across the whole region, but over the course of the investigation that my lab was involved with, we visited 5 properties over the course of 6 days. What we noted on those properties was a high number of aoudad deaths. So that's an exotic sheep species that's well established in Texas. And of course, a high number of white-tailed deer deaths. The other situation in West Texas has a large wildlife ranching operations, and so there are a number of exotic species such as axis deer and damas and other antelopes. And so we saw a high diversity of animals affected on those properties. And it's well known that anthrax can affect most herbivores. But the numbers that we observed to be the highest were the aoudad and the white-tailed deer. Now, whether that's because the whitetail are very, very sensitive to the bacterium, or in the case of the aoudad, that their populations are very high, and so we see a lot of those relative to their population. But those are the 2 species certainly that we saw the most of on the properties we investigated. And in past years, certainly white-tailed deer and aoudad have been highly affected. But we did see a high diversity. In fact, a number of the early reports out of Texas Animal Health Commission were reports of domestic livestock, goats, and horses. So we saw goats, horses, sheep, and cattle have all been reported. And then most all of the wildlife species are at risk.
Now, there is an anthrax vaccine available for the animals. Concerning the domestic animals, did you find that the livestock owners were keeping up with the vaccinations?
So I think that's generally true across the area. It's an area where the ranchers have been battling anthrax for decades and generations, and so there's a lot of good use of vaccine in livestock. Certainly not all the livestock are vaccinated. Oftentimes what will happen is after many years of not seeing disease, this is true of anthrax worldwide, by the way, not in Texas, but after years of not seeing the disease, it's not uncommon for there to be a lapse in vaccination and then an increase or an uptick in vaccine in response to the outbreak. So we definitely see that happening in this area as well as other areas. What we see going on in this area is oftentimes the livestock will be vaccinated. In particular, the cattle and horses will be vaccinated. These are expensive animals that are easy to get to. Oftentimes, sheep and goat populations are so large that it's probably unrealistic to vaccinate them all. So a lot of times ranchers will vaccinate reactively during an outbreak and try and vaccinate their animals as the season goes on. So I think it's a mix of that in every year probably. In terms of the wildlife, the vaccine is safe in most wildlife species. It's an off-label use, meaning there aren't lots of specific clinical trials to understand the safety or efficacy. But it's a relatively safe vaccine. It's been used in a lot of the wildlife species that are in the area. So those animals that can be easily approached, so it's an injectable vaccine, I should state, and so you've got to be able to inject that intramuscularly or administer it subcutaneously into the animal. So in some cases, very high dollar, non-native or non-indigenous wildlife that are either part of high dollar hunting operations or are part of conservation properties. Those animals, there were efforts this year that I'm aware of ranchers and wildlife managers trying to vaccinate some of those high dollar animals. Some cases, they'll do that with dart guns if they can't put the animal into a capture setting. And so there were some efforts to do that. And again, it's an off-use label, but seems to have success. So there's sort of two challenges with vaccine. One is administering it. So that has to be a trade-off between the safety of darting an animal and the efficacy or return on doing the darting. So if you have good, qualified, safe shooters, that's certainly an option. But you just have to weigh the trade-off of injuring an animal with a dart versus administering vaccine. The other challenge is that the vaccine is most successful or most efficacious 21 days or more post-vaccination. So the animal, once it's vaccinated, that's what we call an attenuated live strain. So it's a live bacterium, but it's attenuated, so it doesn't cause disease, but it causes some of those antigen exposures. So the animals can mount a response to a low-dose infection, basically. So that takes time. The body needs to respond. And so that vaccine is most efficacious if administered before an outbreak. So it's a better preventative than it is a reaction. And so administering that out ahead of outbreaks is a higher efficacy than administering it during outbreaks. The other challenge is that there are opportunities to get through a prescription from a veterinarian to get antibiotic-treated protein feed. So trying to get antibiotic out as preventative or reactionary in animals that may have been exposed. The data on that are less clear, again, because it's a very large area and it's hard to know exactly how much feed's going out and the timing of that feed relative to when an outbreak begins on a property. But the chlorotetracycline feed seems to have an effect on reducing intensity of outbreaks or in some cases maybe having it not show up on a property at all. It's tough to know whether that's because local climatic patterns on one ranch versus another. One ranch may have had that wet spring, dry summer rain hypothesis play out where another ranch may not. So we've seen that as well. But the tetracycline feed may be reducing anthrax clinical signs in animals. The challenge, though, is that if you've administered vaccine, you can't administer vaccine and that feed at the same time because that feed will reduce the efficacy of the vaccine. So there's also a trade-off that has to be made about whether or not you think you can impact or affect more animals with vaccine or with feed. And that'll come down to the size of that ranch and the size of the population and the success of animals feeding at feeders. So I think there's a lot happening here that needs to be unpacked to really understand what the intensity of the outbreaks.
Was there any specific actions that Texas officials took to get this outbreak under control, or did it kind of peter out on its own?
So I think that's a really good question, and I think it's one that each health officials and researchers and ranchers are all trying to answer at the same time, so that we can all get better at this. Texas Animal Health Commission, as properties are identified, those properties go under a quarantine, meaning animals can't be moved off of that property, or animals can't be hunted off of that property during that quarantine period. That's to try and ensure that whatever that risk is stays local, so that you don't have animals that might have a latent or an early onset infection, or an early infection being moved and then, succumbing to the disease and contaminating a new area. There are lots of efforts that go on the individual ranches, trying to reduce the outbreak. As I said, veterinarians working with ranchers to get prescriptions in place so that this feed can be administered. That feed can no longer be purchased without a script, so that requires a relationship between ranchers, veterinarians, and feed distributors. On a number of the individual ranches, there are efforts to try and clean up those cases. So WHO, World Health Organization recommendations are burn cases if you can, bury if you can't, or surface decontaminate with bleach spray. So what we often see during these outbreaks are combinations of all of those. Those are based on both availability of personnel and resources, because that's a very labor-intensive task, particularly in rural West Texas where individual properties may be tens of thousands of acres. And in terms of burning carcasses, that's really based on the summertime conditions. So at the end of that rainy period, as you start to get hot, dry conditions again, which is when we see that outbreak really taking off, that, of course, is a very dangerous time to try and set these landscapes on fire without major fire risk. So what we tend to see is a combination of those practices, spraying carcasses with bleach and or pesticides. We've seen that in an effort to try and keep those flies down. And then that surface decontamination will at least reduce the bacterial spore load immediately available at the surface. We do know from studying in our own lab and taking lots of samples out in Texas over the years, that surface decontamination does very little to reduce the bacteria that survives in the bones of those animals. But it will reduce that immediate surface contamination. And then burning is absolutely the best for killing the bacteria, but again, it's a safety issue in terms of whether or not you're in a safe space to burn. The one other issue we have with burning is that if burning isn't done intensively to really get rid of the majority of the biomass of that carcass, then the bacteria may survive. So it's either got to be a very, very thorough burn, or it's probably better just to bury. What we recommend for burial is that burial should be, 6 feet deep and not 3 feet deep, just to reduce the likelihood of that bacteria making its way back to the surface through any leaching process. But what we see is a real mixed bag of those practices to try and reduce the size or clean up the outbreaks. What we do know is obviously it's very difficult to get to every animal, particularly in an outbreak where hundreds or thousands of animals have died. But the more of those carcasses that can be destroyed, the less contamination that may be available for future outbreaks.
Yeah, very interesting. Let me go ahead and just ask you, Dr. Blackburn, any final thoughts on this topic? Any interesting stories you can share or anything like that?
So I think the point I mentioned a few moments ago, that we actually were able to isolate a high quantity of bacteria out of a biting fly immediately after it was feeding on an animal. That's quite exciting. From an academic perspective, that's quite exciting because we're working our way through the list of rules that we call the vector incrimination rules. These are sort of like Koch's postulates for whether or not an insect is playing a role in transmission. So we do know that those biting flies, that their populations explode just ahead of or during these major outbreaks. That alone may just say that whatever is good for the flies is good for the bacterium. But the fact that we've actually now isolated those bacteria. The other thing that we were able to do this year and during a response that we did in 2016, working with a local veterinarian, we're actually starting to amass a series of videos of what anthrax looks like in these last hours and moments before death. So that's a video database that we'll actually make available to the public in the coming months, so that folks that are working on ranches or working with wildlife can go in and see what some of those clinical signs might be if they haven't seen anthrax before. But also we've got video now of these biting flies feeding heavily on anthrax-infected animals from a big outbreak in 2016. So we know that in the moments before death, those animals have lost so much motor function that they cannot use the normal behaviors for shooing flies. So ear wags and head shakes and body shakes and leg stomps and tail wags, all the things that we see animals do to try and get these annoying flies off. Those behaviors end because their motor function is failing. The flies are taking advantage of that, and now we know that the bacterial quantities that we're getting from these flies are probably an establishing dose or an infectious dose. And so if you can imagine an animal covered in hundreds of flies, biting flies, and some percentage of those are picking up the bacterium, that certainly could help explain why we see explosive anthrax in those years and not in other years where we don't see such a high explosion in the biting fly population.
Well, I want to thank you, Dr. Jason Blackburn, for sharing your time and expertise with us. It was very interesting. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.